very hard over the past year to develop a master plan update that's both realistic and feasible to chart the next 20 years of Wittman's future in order to build a sustainable capital improvement plan which supports existing and future aviation demand. The last update to our airport's master plan was done in 2005. And many of those capital projects that were outlined in the 2005 master plan have already been completed. And also certain needs of the airport have changed over that time period to necessitate the undertaking of this master plan update. Periodically, master plans are updated every 15 to 20 years to accommodate future growth, change conditions at the airport, and revise our set of strategic goals that provide the sound planning basis for which we develop our ongoing capital improvement plan. This is our second public meeting of the master planning process. Our first was back in January, of course, in person, where we shared preliminary concepts. We took feedback on those concepts from both the public and various stakeholders and tenants that were present at the meeting, and then we continued to refine the master plan. All of the draft concepts and alternatives that we're sharing today are still considered conceptual in nature, and they're subject to further refinements as we go along, so we do welcome your feedback at the end of the presentation. Some of these refinements will be shaped by our ongoing discussions with both the Wisconsin Bureau of Aeronautics and the Federal Aviation Administration in determining the best and most feasible path forward in several of the focus areas of the master plan. With that, I'd like to give thanks to the Winnebago County Board for their ongoing support of the airport. I'd like to give special thanks to our Aviation Committee. I believe there's a couple of members of the Aviation Committee present on the call. And also the airport's tenant advisory group has been an instrumental part of the process in providing their input the entire way along since we got started last year. With that, I'd like to introduce our project team, and these are the folks that'll be presenting and giving you portions of the presentation today on the master plan process. The first is Evan Barrett with Mead and Hunt. He's the master plan project manager. The second is Rob Sims, the deputy project manager, also for Mead and Hunt. The third is Lydia Werner, project planner from Mead and Hunt. And then Leah Whitfield from the Aviation Planning Group, who will be facilitating our Q&A session at the end. In the room with me, I've got Charles Sweet, who's the Deputy Airport Director, and Pete Rausch, who is the Operations and Maintenance Manager for the airport. I'd like to thank also County Executive Mark Harris for his leadership at the county level and oversight of the airport as well, as our partners with the FAA and the Bureau of Aeronautics who've been involved since the beginning and continue to be involved in finishing out this master plan. With that, I'd also like to specifically introduce Mary Beth Gabbert. She's the chair of the Winnebago County Aviation Committee that oversees the airport's day-to-day operations from a supervisory level on the county board. And with that, Mary Beth, I'd be honored if you could provide a few comments before we get started.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much. Thank you all for attending this virtual meeting this afternoon. And as Jim mentioned, there will be another one at 6 o'clock tonight. Evan and Rob will do a presentation for you as the public meeting part of this master plan. And there, as Jim has mentioned, a lot of drafts still in the works and a lot of questions can be asked and answered, hopefully. Don't be afraid to ask a question or give us some input on any item that you see fit. This is a work in progress, and I believe Mead and Hunt is the right choice that we made for this master plan update. They have been nothing but accommodating to us and listening to us from all sources, whether it be the tenants, the tenant advisory group, Jim, Charles, myself, the committee, and the public have been more than welcome to put any input into this master plan. That being said, I think that you will probably enjoy the presentation that Evan and Rob will make, and it is worth listening to. And at the end, please ask any of your questions you want, because they will follow through and get you answers if they don't have them. So enjoy this presentation, and thank you again for coming.
All right, Jim, did you have anything else you wanted to say, or should I go ahead?
Just say thank you to Mary Beth for those comments, and I was going to turn it back to you, Evan, to give the ground rules and the master plan process.
Excellent. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Mary Beth. It is our pleasure to serve the Wittman Regional Airport and help you put together your master plan for your airport and for your community. We've been involved in putting together this master plan for a little over a year now. We have gone through a number of phases, and we're kind of really in the heart of the master plan process right now. So it really is a key time for people to provide their input. So you'll notice that we have all the participants muted right now. We will keep the participants muted throughout the presentation just so we can limit distractions. But at the end of the open house, as Jim mentioned, we will have a question and answer session. And there are a couple different ways to submit your questions, which I'll go over in a moment. But first of all, I just want to kind of give you a roadmap for where we're going with the presentation. And I should note the presentation we've scheduled for roughly 45 minutes with a follow-on Q&A session of up to 45 minutes. If we go beyond an hour and a half, we certainly can do that if there are additional questions, but that's kind of our goal here. I'm going to talk about the housekeeping items as well as the master plan status pieces of the agenda. After that, I'll hand it over to Rob Sims from Mead & Hunt to talk about design principles. He'll also go into our focus area on the Crosswind Runway Taxiway Complex and present alternatives that we've put together to date there. Then Rob will turn it over to Lydia Werner, planner for Mead & Hunt as well, and she will talk about our concepts we put together for the East GA hangar area, the terminal area, and the turf operations area. And then after Lydia is complete with that, I'll talk about next steps, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And I think Jim mentioned, but we have Leah Whitfield from the Aviation Planning Group on the line, and she will be reading questions from the group at that time. So, housekeeping items. I'm just going to go through these quickly. We might have people who join later in the meeting, so we'll make sure to put the housekeeping items in the chat box as well. So this meeting is being held virtually to comply with recommendations to limit the spread of COVID-19 while also seeking public input on the process. The project team spent a lot of time debating whether or not we should have a meeting in person, and we really would have liked to have a meeting in person. Unfortunately, with this unprecedented time we find ourselves in, it just made sense for all involved for us to do this remotely, and we're trying to make it as effective as we can, even though we're all not together in the same room. If you are participating online, please ensure your name is displayed. Screenshots of the attendee list will be taken for attendance after the meeting. As Jim mentioned, this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the project website. So by participating in this meeting, you consent to your voice, likeness, and any materials you provide being recorded for use and dissemination without compensation, and you release the Wittman Regional Airport, Winnebago County, and Mead & Hunt from any and all claims, liability, or damages arising from any such use. So as I mentioned, the audience will have audio and video deactivated until the designated Q&A period. We welcome your questions and comments after the presentation. Any participants during the Q&A session that purposely disrupt the meeting will be removed and not allowed re-entry. So how do you submit your questions? Well, you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the chat function, or at any time during the Q&A session as well. So please note that the chat box, anything you put in the chat box can be seen by all participants and will be read aloud by the moderator and addressed at the end of the presentation. Following reading any questions that we have in the chat box, we will call on people who have used the raise hand function. So if in your settings under the participant tab in the Zoom meeting window, you will find the ability to raise your hand. And I'll have a slide at the end that shows you exactly how to do this. But so when Leah calls on you, then please state your full name and limit your question to 3 minutes. And if you aren't comfortable giving your question, asking your question or giving your comments during the meeting, you can always contact myself or Jim Shell after the meeting, and we can follow up with you then. Just a couple other housekeeping items that I just want to make sure I noted. The view mode can be changed to side by side. So if you're having any issues with the video overlaying the actual presentation material, then go up into the upper right hand corner under the view mode button and you can change the view mode. So master plan process, I just want to provide an overview of where we've been and where we're going. So this is a general master plan process diagram that shows the various components of a master plan. So the first component, inventory, we completed that last summer. We actually came out to the airport during AirVenture and really enjoyed that. Unfortunately, we couldn't come this year. We completed the forecast last fall. We moved into the facility requirements. And so when we held the first public meeting in January, we were right in the middle of the facility requirements and just starting the alternatives. So since January, we've been spending a lot of time putting together alternative concepts, studying them, discussing them with tenants, discussing them with FAA and the WSDOT Bureau of Aeronautics. And so the concepts that we're showing here today are, as Mary Beth said, still very much works in progress, but represent a lot of input that we've received from numerous stakeholders. Following the alternatives analysis later this year, we will develop an implementation plan. So that's where we identify how the projects will be phased over the next 20 years, what funding sources might be available, and what sort of regulatory approvals are needed. And then the last step in the process is to update the airport layout plan, which is basically a blueprint of the airport that shows any future projects the airport is planning. And this plan must be up to date in order to receive state or federal funding for capital improvement projects. So just to summarize some of our coordination to date, we have a very intensive coordination process with airport staff and tenants. Has been very in-depth, and we appreciate everyone's input. The tenant advisory group, comprised of approximately 12 members, has been a critical piece of that coordination process. So we have held 4 afternoon meetings throughout the process so far. We plan to hold a couple more before we're all done. And we've held several individual interviews with specific stakeholders since the beginning of the project. As I mentioned, the initial open house was held in January, and we are posting a lot of the materials from the meetings and draft chapters on the project website. So I encourage you to visit the project website to see that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to hand it over to Rob Sims to launch into the technical portion of the presentation. There you go. Got it, Rob?
All right, there we are. All right, hello everyone. So thanks a lot for being here. Like Evan said, my name is Rob Sims, another one of the planners on this project. So before we really dive into the specifics of the alternatives that we developed, we wanted to take a moment to go through some of the design principles that drive them. This will give us a better understanding of why the alternatives look the way they do. There's a lot of guidance that determines the safety areas around pavement, the width of the pavement, things like that. So we wanted to take some time to go through those with you. So first up, we have the critical aircraft. This is really kind of one of the foundational aspects of airport planning and improvements on existing facilities as well. So really the critical aircraft, the way this is defined is that it is considered the most demanding aircraft that conducts at least 500 annual operations at an airport. So for instance, let's say we have some big business jet or something like that that comes in and lands 250 times a year and then takes off. Well, an operation is either one takeoff or one landing. So that would be a total of 500 operations for that aircraft. And then the way that we sort critical aircraft, I'm going to turn on my laser here so you can see my pointer better. Here we are. And the way that we sort critical aircraft is by this table on the right. So it's really comprised of 2 different components. We have the aircraft approach category and the airplane design groups. So for this one, this is really just simply how fast the aircraft is coming in when it lands. So it's approach speed. Basically, the greater the approach speed, the greater the letter. And then over here, this is simply based on these Roman numerals and corresponds to just how big the aircraft is. So for instance, let's say we have some kind of medium-sized business jet. Something like that would probably come in between 91 knots and 121 knots. So it would be a B category. And then its tail height would probably be between 20 and 29, wingspan between 49 and 78, as you can see on the table here. So it would be 2. So we would call that a B2 aircraft. And then based on the designation that we have here, be it B2 or A6 or E1 or whatever it is, that then determines a lot of the design principles that we use for these facilities. So if we're talking specifically about the Wittman Airport, though, the way this breaks down is that for our aircraft approach category, and because you can choose these things individually, it doesn't all have to be connected to one aircraft. So the fastest aircraft that we have regularly operating at the Wittman Airport are these business aircraft right here. The Challenger 300, the 600, the Learjet 45. As you can see, it's a smaller aircraft, but it's quick. So all of these aircraft are category C and conduct at least 500 annual operations when combined together. So we have a C designation for the airport. Then if we look down here, we can see a variety of large aircraft. So we have here the Basler Turbo 67s, the DC-3s that they convert into the Basler Turbo 67. So we have a lot of operations by these aircraft, as well as, of course, we have EAA on the field, which means we have a lot of vintage aircraft as well, like these large World War II bombers, the aluminum overcast. So because of these large aircraft, that gets us a category of 3. So when we consider the runway, or excuse me, the airport as a whole, we have a designation of C3. However, we don't just make this critical aircraft designation for the airport as a whole and then call it good. We also do a critical aircraft designation for every runway on the airfield, as well as some of the other areas that support the runways. So if we're looking at the 2 largest runways on the airport, well, it would make sense that we have a C3 designation. However, if we look at the 2 smaller runways, the 2 diagonal runways, well, they're smaller runways, so it shouldn't be surprising that we do have smaller aircraft operating on them. These are some of the smaller aircraft that operate on the airfield right now. We have some tailwheel planes, the Sonics aircraft, which is of course a business that operates from the airport, so we see a lot of them and their different variants, and then a lot of home-built and experimental aircraft as well, the Vans RV-12 being a popular one. So for our 2 larger runways, we have the larger C3 designation. For our smaller 2 diagonal runways, we have a smaller designation, the AB small 1, and that's kind of a mouthful compared to C3, but if we break it down, AB, we have this together because a lot of the standards for A and B are the same. The small simply means that these aircraft are less than 12,500 pounds, and 12,500 pounds is about the size of a medium-sized business jet, so yes, these are considerably smaller than that. And then the 1, again, just corresponds to how big the aircraft is. So AB1 for short. Now, once we determine the critical aircraft, that really only corresponds to how we would design the runway. And even if you design the best runway in the world, but you can't pay for it, well, it's really not going to do you a lot of good. And so we also want to take a look at the way these runways are classified for eligibility for federal funding. The way these are classified are shuffled into these 4 categories that you can see here on this table on the right. Now, the first 3, primary, crosswind, and secondary, are all eligible for federal funding. However, the very last one here, additional, is not. It's not eligible for federal funding. So really we need to figure out where the runways at Wittman fit into these different categories. So the primary runway, you can read the actual definition there, but it's also usually just the biggest runway, the runway with the greatest runway length, the best approaches, and so that's pretty simple. Runway 1836 is larger, it has better approaches, that's our primary runway at Wittman. For our other 2 categories, crosswind, basically if you have an aircraft and you're coming into land and you have a crosswind coming from the side, if that crosswind gets stronger and stronger, at some point you're not going to be able to land your aircraft in that direction. And so instead, you need another runway to land where the crosswind coverage is a little better. So it's not coming from your side so strong. And we'll get into a little more detail on exactly what this means and what those thresholds are on the next slide. But for now, just know that if you can't land with adequate wind coverage 95% of the time on your primary runway, well, then you need a crosswind runway to help support it. Our next condition, or our next category, is a secondary runway. Now for a secondary runway, if you imagine an airport, every single airport in the world is going to have some type of theoretical limit to where it can no longer support the number of operations that are coming into it. If you keep pumping more and more and more operations and airplanes into a single airport, at some point, delays are going to start happening, things are going to get bogged down. And so when we hit 60% of that theoretical limit for how many operations an airport can take, well, we're going to need more runways to support those operations. And so that's where our secondary runway comes in. Now, if we look at runway 927, we think it serves both as a crosswind runway because runway 1836, the primary, doesn't meet every wind condition out there. and also serves as a secondary to support more operations than 1836 could by itself. We do have to emphasize, these are still classifications that we're talking through the FAA with. So when I say that this is how we consider it, this is the way we're looking at it right now, although we're continuing to have conversations with the FAA about it. So that leaves the question though, if we have a primary and then 927, which is a crosswind, and a secondary, where do those two smaller runways fit into this picture? As the FAA sees it right now, they would be additional runways. They wouldn't fit into any of these categories. And so that would mean that they would be additional runways and therefore ineligible for federal funding. So if these runways magically needed to be replaced tomorrow, as it stands right now, the FAA would not pay for it, which is difficult given that they usually provide about 90% of funds for projects like this. That can vary, of course. So let's get a little bit more into crosswind tolerances, because when we're taking a close look at these diagonal runways, this is kind of the role that we think they serve right now. So this is the way that crosswind tolerance works. If you have a large aircraft, be it something for the larger air carriers like this, well, bigger planes, and you can see the corresponding critical aircraft categories that we went through earlier, then you get something like you get a 20-knot crosswind coverage. Basically, what this is saying is that these aircraft are good to land even when they have a crosswind of 20 knots or less. And keep in mind here, this is just an FAA planning tool. This isn't necessarily saying this is the actual limitation of these aircraft. I'm sure if you have a fantastic pilot, you know, you can land in just about anything probably. But for the purposes of planning, 20 knots is their cutoff. So as you can imagine, as you get smaller and smaller aircraft, this crosswind tolerance goes down for business aircraft, for larger business aircraft, and for regional jets, 16 knots, and then it goes down. And the smallest category that we have that the FAA currently considers for a crosswind coverage is A1 and B1, these small things like Cessnas, things like that, which is 10.5 knots. So this is the smallest category that we have from the FAA, is this 10.5 knot crosswind coverage. However, as we pointed out, we have some small planes that are using those diagonal runways. And as we had conversations with airport tenants, like Evan mentioned, we have the tenant advisory group that we are able to converse with and help us see the unique aspects that go on at this airport. Well, these planes, they think, don't really meet this 10.5 knots. They think that's too high for them. And so we wanted to take a closer look at these really small aircraft, particularly the tail wheels that tend to be more susceptible to crosswinds. Now, when we look at these different aircraft, based on conversations that we had, we also went to the actual, just the manuals, the owner's manual for the aircraft and design manuals for the aircraft to see what their crosswind tolerance should be. And the number that we landed on after a long process was 7 knots. So if we look at the 7-knot limitation and how that works compared to the FAA's current standards, well, I'll just direct your attention to this table over here. So like I said, you should be able to land on a runway, or at an airport at least, 95% of the time without exceeding that crosswind coverage that we just showed in these categories down here at the bottom. If you don't have that coverage, well, another runway is needed. Currently, the FAA's lowest coverage, lowest crosswind tolerance is this 10.5 knots. And if we look at just the two big runways, 1836 and 927, well, we're well above that 95% threshold. We're at 98.8%, excellent coverage. However, if we look at the 7 knots for these smaller airplanes that we're considering, again, only the two runways, well, we're only at about 93%, 92.67%, so under that 95%. So really, if we're looking at these smaller planes and using a 7-knot crosswind tolerance, those two large runways don't provide adequate wind coverage, and we do need an extra runway to hit that 95% threshold. So that's where runways 523 and runway 1331 comes in. So if we compare runway 523 and we take it and we match it up with both the big runways, well, then we get 96.42% for this 7-knot crosswind. And this is all weather. This is just every recording of the weather that happens over the past several years. If we look at VFR conditions, that's visual flight rules. In other words, good weather. You can generally just fly the plane without necessarily using your instruments, but just by looking out the window, runway 1331 offers slightly better. And then if we look down here at IFR, that's instrument flight rules, or poor weather, so you have to rely on your instruments instead of just visually looking out the window, then runway 523 offers better coverage. So if we're looking at these two runways, for 7-knot crosswind tolerances, Runway 523 ekes out with a little bit of advantage, providing a little more crosswind tolerance, but they are pretty close. So really what we're looking at right now is that one of these runways should be considered a crosswind runway, probably 523. But again, this is a conversation that's ongoing with the FAA. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up the way we're looking at these diagonal runways, the way that the FAA is considering runways right now is that they're kind of not reclassifying, but they're taking a look at all the runways at airports across the country. And keep in mind, I mean, most airports, even ones that are as big as Oshkosh, only have 2 runways. Whitman has 4. Of course, Whitman is a unique airport and there's a lot going on, but that's a lot of runways. And so the FAA wants to have these runways categorized. And again, the FAA federal funding usually accounts for about 90% of funding for runways and projects like this. And so if that were to go away, well, local sources, not just at Whitman and the surrounding county, but just across the nation, usually can't support that, usually can't match what the FAA and federal funding is able to do. Because if that funding goes away, suddenly their bill to do the same thing that they've been doing the whole time would increase tenfold. Now, again, neither of the diagonal runways are currently considered eligible for federal funding by the FAA, so this is something that we're looking at. In the event that funding remains unavailable, depending on what their classification ends up being, at least one of these runways may require closure. So that's what we're looking at right now. And if one of them does require closure, well, we need to pick the one that will, continue to provide an efficient layout and circulation for future conditions at the airport. As you can see down here, even if a runway goes away, we're still looking to preserve maximum utility for the airport. And even if we do close down a runway, that doesn't mean that if a runway is closed down, it doesn't mean that it necessarily has to remove all the pavement, it just disappears entirely. It could serve another function like a taxiway or a ramp. And so we want to consider that as well. Okay, catch up there. So Whitman is a large airport. And so we wanted to break out the different alternatives into separate focus areas. And these focus areas are comprised of the following sections. So since it is such a large airport, we do have a lot going on. We have a lot of flight training and Basler turbo conversions down here. Of course, we have EAA in this area, a lot of GA hangars, businesses, GA-centric activity here, and then a lot of businesses and other tenants in the north as well. So the way that we broke this up, first off, we have the Crosswind Runway Taxiway Complex outlined in blue. It's a long name, but there's a lot going on. We have both the diagonal runways right here. We have a lot of taxiways right here. So we'll dive into that area in just a moment here. Next up, where I'll turn it over to Lydia, we have the East GAA area, which comprises a lot of hangars, but the buildings and other buildings as well, but some of them are in poor condition, some need replacement. And of course, we know that Whitman is currently at full capacity and everybody wants more hangars. The airport, we do, everybody wants more hangars so we can get more planes here. In addition to that, we have the terminal area, which for the purposes of this master plan and presentation, goes all the way over to this area here where these hangars are here. So of course we have the passenger terminal, but we also have a lot of open space. So we want to see how we can best use that open space and reconfigure this area to meet the needs of the airport in the future. Then finally, the last alternative that we'll be presenting today is for the turf operations area. Now this area is just south of the runway 9 threshold, and the proposal here is to provide an area for pilots to land in the grass. Some pilots, particularly those with tailwheel aircraft, prefer to land in the grass over pavement. It's better for their aircraft and a little safer as well, they would tell you. And so we want to take a look at that as well. So I'll kick us off here with the first set before I turn it over to Lydia. So I'll be covering the Crosswind Runway Taxiway Complex. So this is a little bit better of a look at these areas and everything that's going on here. We have both the diagonal runways, we have taxiways, Alpha 1, Alpha, Charlie 1, all converging in this area. There's a lot going on, and that's the reason that the FAA has designated 2 different hotspots. We have hotspot 1 right here and hotspot 2 down here. For those on the phone, hotspot 1 is kind of in the center of runway 927 where runway 13 converges on it, and hotspot 2 is where kind of centered around Charlie 1 and consists of a lot of different taxiways in that area, as well as runway 1331. So keep in mind here, because it's designated a hotspot, that doesn't necessarily mean anything's happened in the past. It just means that in the FAA's opinion, this is an area where pilots require additional vigilance. And let's say, this area in hotspot 2 with all these taxiways, let's say that magically needed reconstruction tomorrow. The FAA wouldn't pay to rebuild it like this because of its complexity. And so not only were we looking to simplify things, but that also keeps us eligible for additional funding. So I mentioned earlier that when we have these two diagonal runways, depending on how they're classified in the future, one of them may need to close. Hopefully only one of them may need to close. And so what we're looking at is which runway would better serve. And we kind of alluded to this earlier when we were talking about crosswind coverages. So if we look at runway 1331, well, as you can see, it's pretty centrally positioned in both hotspots, both in hotspot 1 and passes right through the middle of hotspot 2. So we have quite a lot going on around runway 1331. And based on conversations that we've had with airport tenants and with air traffic control, well, a lot of the utility of this runway is actually just serving as a taxiway because it allows the north area here to connect to the east GA area here. It provides a nice conduit through this area. If we compare this to runway 523, well, obviously it's a longer runway, so that's a clear advantage. It also has really no interaction with these complex intersections. The hotspot number 1 and 2, it stays essentially completely clear of. Finally, it does have slightly better crosswind coverage than when we compare it to runway 1331, and then it also serves some purposes during AirVenture as well, with aircraft staging up here near this threshold, and a lot of warbird parking down here on the runway 5 threshold. So now we'll kind of go into the alternatives that we developed. This is kind of the first beginning of what I like to refer to as the heart and soul of the master plan, the alternatives chapter. So this is what we've been working on since we last saw you. So this is phase 1. We have 2 phases for this area. We have 2 options for the second phase as well, options A and B. So I'll walk you through those. So this is phase 1. As you can see, it's really quite simple. It suggests putting a bend into taxiway J to reconnect over to taxiway Alpha. The first thing we considered was looking at Charlie 1 and just taking out Charlie 1. It's really kind of the central hub of all these different intersections. And if that goes away, well, it automatically simplifies this intersection a lot. However, if you simply take away Charlie 1, you'll notice if you're over here in the East GA area, well, you really have no good way to get over here to runway 1836 or runway 5. The only way would be to taxi down here and up runway 1331, which is taxiing on a runway, not ideal, or to go all the way up here to the terminal area, connect to taxiway Alpha, and then taxi south. Not only is that long and inconvenient, but you would have numerous runway crossings while you do it, which also is not ideal. So we needed to maintain this connection to taxiway A, and the way we did that was, like I said, putting this bend in taxiway J. So a pretty simple connection, but it allows us to remove Charlie 1, and in doing so, begin to simplify this area. So that's phase 1. For phase 2, and this is option A, we have option A and B, but for option A, we start adding a bit on to the south here. We take runway 1331, we convert it to a taxiway, and keep an additional width here. So this is a 50-foot taxiway that's shown, and in areas where it overlaps with the existing runway 1331, we keep paved shoulders on the side. So we have a 50-foot taxiway. Paved shoulders gives us a total of 75 feet of pavement. Now that width allows a little more maneuverability, particularly for tailwheel aircraft. When they taxi, they have to kind of go back and forth since their nose is right in front of them. They need to be able to see. And then it also provides a little more room for two-way traffic during AirVenture as well. So down here, we also have another connection to this area. So we have not only the single connection from taxiway J to taxiway A, we also have this additional connection right here down to the south. So that would provide 2 options for people coming from the East GA area to connect with taxiway Alpha and move around the airport as they need to. This also provides a nice square geometry, so a little more symmetrical. Then as we come up this taxiway here, this will provide connection, again, maintain connection rather, to the north side of the airport. Whereas right here, this would take a bend to the left and then have a 90-degree turn that would meet taxiway B3 on the north side of runway 927. This would provide an area to cross runway 927. However, at the cost of cutting into some of the AirVenture parking. That's what the orange is right here, is AirVenture parking. So as we move this taxiway to the west, we're impacting about 2 acres of what would otherwise be parking. The other impact of this alternative is that this kind of paved area in there, it's maybe a little hard to see in this graphic, but that is an ARF staging station during AirVenture. So that's aircraft rescue and firefighting. So this would need to be relocated elsewhere. So this is option A. Now we'll show option B. So for option B, really, as you can see, the vast majority of it to the east side is really the same. It's only over here on the west that we make any significant changes as compared to option A. So we put this northbound bend in the taxiway a bit earlier. So we end up with an entirely new crossing across runway 927. And that has a couple advantages. Not only is it further away from the parking and has no immediate impacts, but it also aids in capacity. As aircraft are rapidly landing on this runway, let's say during AirVenture, but also during the other 51 weeks of the year during periods of peak activity, this offers two areas where they can turn off and therefore increasing the capacity of the airport. The other advantage is that, like I said, we're not cutting into the parking or this ARF staging area, so that would not need to be relocated. And then we could also follow up with a phase 3, I suppose it would be, for option B by extending this taxiway right here. So this is taxiway Papa down here, and we could extend this piece so taxiway Papa would run the full length of the this portion of the airfield to connect with taxiway B. Right now, taxiway Alpha is really the only way to get between taxiway, or excuse me, the north side of the airport and the south side of the airport. So that makes taxiway A bottleneck during busy times. By extending Papa like this and connecting all the way to taxiway B, that gives us a second connection between the north and the south side of the airport. And so during busy periods, you could, for instance, have southbound travel on taxiway A and maybe northbound travel on taxiway Papa, but you would have better circulation and less bottlenecks. This does cut into parking a bit more, as you can see in the future. However, based on conversations with the EAA, they'd still be able to use this area. They might not use it for parking, but they'd still be able to make use of it to the east of the extended Papa. And then based on conversations with Tower and air traffic control, they do favor this option based on the circulation it offers. So those are the two options, well, the three options really that we've come up with for the central area, the crosswind runway taxiway complex. And now I'll turn it over to Lydia, and she will take us into the East GA area right here and the rest of the alternatives. And I will stop sharing as well. Okay.
Thanks, Rob. All right, welcome everybody. So as Rob talked about just a little bit ago, I'm going to be covering the alternatives for the East GA area, the terminal area, and then the turf operating area. My slide to advance. All right, so first we're going to talk a little bit about the East GA hangar layout. As many of you know, if you're joining us and you're a tenant or you're familiar with the airport, and those of us who aren't familiar with the airport, this area houses several different types of activities. We have many private tenants that are located here, businesses such as Sonics, and then some transient aircraft utilize this area as well. So there's a lot going on in the East GA area. However, the facilities in this area do present several challenges. Namely, there are a lot of buildings in this area that are aging and need removal or replacement. The orientations of many of the buildings are in all different directions, and not many of them are along a similar axis. And lastly, we have many taxiways and taxi lanes in this area that don't conform to FAA design standards. So those are just some of the factors that we considered as we put together these alternatives. All right, one of the main topics that came up before we designed any alternatives for this area was really looking at the taxiway object-free area, otherwise known as the TOFA. The TOFA is designed to provide separation from obstacles for taxiing aircraft as you're moving in and out of hangar areas to get to the rest of the airport. Now, in this area currently, we have existing pavement that does vary in width and clearance. So we see a lot of different sizes in here. So one of the things we looked at were two different TOFAs for small aircraft sizes, which we anticipate will be utilizing this area the most. And so we have two different TOFAs shown here. The red is 49 feet wide and the blue is 79 feet wide. So before we designed the types of hangars and put together some alternatives, we looked at the hangar demand. And when we did a hangar demand analysis, we looked at what our based aircraft forecast would be. And this is something we covered in great detail when we did the forecast chapter, which we've submitted to the FAA for review. So our based aircraft forecast, starting in the base year of 2018 with an out year of 2038, shows an increase of 33 aircraft over the planning period. However, there are a lot of other factors that go into the base aircraft demand, one of which being the accounting for the waiting list and future growth. So we did a modified forecast called a demand adjusted forecast. And this, when it accounts for the waiting list and the future growth, we actually show an increase of 91 aircraft over a 20-year planning period. So the alternatives that we'll present today, we're currently going to show an increase of 72 units, but this will also include large hangars such as community hangars that could house multiple aircraft instead of just one aircraft. And then we are also going to reserve some additional hangar space to cover the balance of the demand that we are forecasting in the East GA area. So before we get into alternatives, we looked at this particular layout and we saw that the layout in this area could be categorized in 3 different planning areas. First, we have an area for realignment. So purple area shown here really is just a lot of different facing hangars. The green area, we call it the established area, and then the blue is the replacement area. So there are several goals that we want to keep in mind as we put together alternatives. First of all, we want to remove those aging buildings and ones that are in poor condition. Secondly, we wanted to position new buildings and put the layout as such where all the buildings are on a similar axis, so it all looks kind of the same. Next, we want to maintain businesses that are already in place and hangars that are in good condition. And then we want to provide symmetrical taxi lanes with proper spacing. Like I was getting to earlier, talking about the TOFAs, ensuring that the aircraft we design this area for are able to move in and out of these areas in a safe fashion. All right, so the realignment phase, shown here in purple. So in this phase, we found that there's a lot of poor pavement conditions throughout this area. There's also a lot of open area with aprons that are not being utilized. We have buildings that are on many different orientations. They face in all different directions. And then we also have several vehicle access points in this area. The established area, again, that's in green. This has a general building alignment. This area has parallel or perpendicular taxiways and buildings that present really an overall efficient layout. And future buildings, we want to attempt to align with this area. So the established area is kind of the backbone of the alternatives for this area. And then lastly, in blue, we have this area identified for replacement. So like I said earlier, there are a lot of buildings here that are in poor condition. There's a large group of port-to-port hangars that are going to be removed, but be replaced with hangars elsewhere. And we really want to make use of a lot of this unoccupied area that's currently sitting open and ready for development. And then lastly, similar to other areas, we have some taxiways that need to be realigned and some layouts that could be improved. So similar to what Rob discussed with the phasing, we also are looking at a phased approach for these alternatives. So phase 1 is very important because this really sets the stage for the subsequent phases. So in this phase, we are showing two 10-unit T hangars being constructed over here on the south side, along with pavement connected to taxiway Charlie. So this would allow us to relocate existing tenants into new T hangars and then remove the porta-ports that are currently down here. Next, we would show these freestanding hangars up here in the north end removed. Again, with these new T hangars, it allows us to relocate tenants without disruption. Some of the things we do need to consider in this area, there are multiple utility lines for various utilities that run through the East GA area. So for this phase and subsequent phases, we really put together alternatives that would prevent the airport from having to spend a bunch of time and money relocating these utilities. So maximizing the space, but also you'll notice that certain areas are not touched simply because there is a major utility in that area. So this phase also shows some box hangars that will be added in some uninhibited areas. And of course, removing the porta-ports and then prepping this particular site for future facilities. Phase 2, again, builds on phase 1. So you see the new box hangars, new T hangars, In this phase, we show the SRE and maintenance facility along with the fueling station will be relocated down to this area, which is reserved for the future. It's really so it can open up this portion of the East GA area for future development. We also show a T hangar with automobile parking off of Taxiway Juliet. There isn't a whole lot of car parking for tenants at the airport, so we wanted to provide an option for tenants to park their cars while they're utilizing their hangars. Some of the feedback we have gotten from the technical advisory group was telling us that we have some vehicle access points that do need to be expanded, so our future alternatives will be addressing that, and our final alternatives will address that as well. Additionally, we show another T hangar being added where the porta ports used to be. We also be adding or showing an alternative with tie downs in this area. And again, we have a TOFA of 79 feet. So for the type of aircraft that are utilizing these box hangars, just ensuring they're able to move in and out of this area in a safe fashion. And of course, again, hangars that are added in this area are going to be spaced accordingly to avoid these utilities. And as you can see down here, Rob talked about earlier with Taxiway Juliet having a bend in that, removing the Taxiway Charlie 1, but then also utilizing the runway to turn it into a taxiway. Phase 3. So this is the final phase for the alternatives that we're considering. We see more hangars being added up here to the north along with taxi lanes. These hangars may be limited due to the airspace restrictions, so the size and height will be dependent on the airspace, primarily because of the runways that are located in the vicinity. Again, adding more hangars as the utilities allow. And then whenever possible, having the hangars doors face south unless they're blocked by other facilities. As we know, southern facing door is ideal, primarily because it melts the snow faster. One other area to consider is straightening Taxiway Charlie 3, which is not existing. The existing Charlie 3 is not to FAA design standards, so we will be straightening out Charlie 3 to bring that into design standards. And then, of course, we have several areas here that are reserved for future development. As we talked about earlier, our hangar analysis showed us even with all of these extra alternatives, we'll still need a few extra hangars. So there are several areas here that are reserved for future development. But overall, in phase 3, we see additional increase of 68 hangar units in total compared to the existing hangars today. All right, so now we'll move into terminal area. Similar to the East GA area, the terminal area has several things that we need to consider before we could start drafting alternatives. For instance, we do need additional hangars in this area. As we talked about previously, the demand for based aircraft. There's also a demand for larger hangars that can accommodate corporate jets. There are buildings in this area that are aging that need to be removed. We have some non-standard taxiway configuration to be corrected, and general aviation facilities that currently do not match the demand. And then we have some areas, significant in nature, that are prime location and are currently undeveloped. So the alternatives we are considering right now show Taxiway Bravo being redesigned and relocated to match the airport design standards. So we eliminate Bravo 4, bring Bravo to the east, and take a 90-degree tie-in to runway 927. We also show corporate hangars up here in the northwestern part of the figure with an additional parking behind them for tenants and users. We also show removal of these airport-owned facilities that are aging. Basler Flight Service hangar will remain, but there will be additional room freed up by removing these aging hangars to allow aircraft to taxi in and out safely and efficiently. And of course, many of you who are involved with the airport know that the new GA terminal is currently being constructed. So we show the future location of that, the fuel farm that's being relocated, parking, and then we have several areas here that are not developed at the moment. Some of this will be torn down as part of the terminal project, removing the old terminal. So there are several areas that are reserved for aeronautical and non-aeronautical development. And that's usually areas that could happen within the planning period where there might be an interested party, but a lot of it is reserved for beyond the planning period. All right, the turf operating area. As Rob was talking about earlier, turf operating areas are really desirable for tailwheel aircraft or tenants that may want to land their aircraft in the grass. Turf is also used by those in flight training to practice soft field landings, so it's just built into part of their training. So the airport staff asked us to consider as part of this master plan what it would take to include a turf operating area in our alternatives. Currently, the guidance that is out there, there was a regional FAA guidance document release that is currently canceled while the national guidance is being developed. However, we've used the regional as a starting point and kind of a guide to anticipate the needs. Now, for a turf operating area, it is treated as a runway to which it is adjacent. So by that token, simultaneous operations are not usually permitted. So as Rob indicated earlier, the area that we're considering in the alternatives is just south of the runway 9 end. And we're looking at 2 alternatives at this time. Both of these alternatives start 250 feet beyond the runway 9 end. And one alternative is located outside of the runway 927 safety area. And the other location is located just inside the runway safety area. And both of these alternatives are 2,250 feet long and 60 feet wide. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Evan to cover the next steps.
Thanks, Lydia. Let me share my screen here real quick. So next steps, where do we go from here? So we have some work left to do. So our next step after we collect public input, we'll finalize preferred alternatives. We'll be having further discussions with our partners at the Federal Aviation Administration and the WSDOT Bureau of Aeronautics, as well as local tenants. We'll develop a implementation plan, which, as I mentioned at the top, includes a phasing plan, funding source analysis, and regulatory approval analysis. And then we will present a 20-year conceptual development plan to the Aviation Committee, to the Tenant Advisory Group, and the County Board and general public. So we do have quite a bit of work left to do, and several additional opportunities for public input. So we will be having another public open house at a later date to be determined. Hopefully by that time, we will be able to have that meeting in person. I guess we'll really need to monitor current events and you know, do what's right for the community. So we'll move into the open Q&A session.